Okay, actually I am quite German, so we're going to start sharp. Welcome to everyone to the EGMP webinar series. It's really fantastic to see so many people registered for this webinar. And I am particularly pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Fred Johnson. He is a researcher in the Department of Ecoscience at Aarhus University in Denmark. Dr. Johnson has over 3 decades of experience supporting conservation decision-making in both Europe and North America. And he has taught the principles of adaptive management to undergraduate and graduate students, conservation practitioners, and administrations in a variety of venues. And Dr. Johnson is also a member of the European Goose Management Platform and has since the beginning of the establishment of this platform, helped shaping the processes under this initiative. So today he'll be giving a lecture on the adaptive management concepts, applications, and challenges. Now, very quickly, before I hand over to him, I would like to let you all know that we will be recording this session, and the recordings will be uploaded to the EGMP website with a link to our YouTube channel so that your colleagues who haven't been able to attend can also watch this webinar at some other stage. Also, there is going to be 2 presentations with a break in between. And we're hoping that after each of the presentations, there'll be a Q&A where you'll be able to ask all your questions either by raising your hand or adding your questions into the chat. And you can also add questions into the chat that are like if it's a question about understanding what was just presented, like a very quick question, you could also add it there and it could be maybe responded straight away. Otherwise, we'll be taking the questions afterwards. And with this, Fred, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Ava, and hello, everybody. Good morning from sunny Florida. Hope you all are staying warm and healthy in Europe. Okay, so we'll try to be fairly informal today, and if in addition to some Q&A after the 2 lectures, if you have a quick question just for clarification of something I said, then go ahead and raise your hand or put it in the chat, and I'll try to answer it right away. Okay, so what we're looking at here is I did a search of the term adaptive management among journal articles in the Web of Science. And what you can see, since you can't see the years down on the x-axis very well, but it starts in about the late 1970s, and you can see exponential growth in the mention of adaptive management in technical journals. And by now, the sort of the core principles of adaptive management of the idea that you're learning to manage while managing to learn are pretty much accepted now by all resource professionals as a sensible way of doing business. But the reality is that success stories are fairly rare, and often the examples that you do see in literature fail to meet one or more of the basic requirements of adaptive management. And adaptive management, the term adaptive management, has really become so pervasive in the conservation literature that it's sort of come to mean everything and therefore nothing. And so to cynics, it's often regarded as just jargon that really has little meaning. And so this quote by political scientist Kai Lee is as true today as it was over 20 years ago. So what we want to try to do today is dig in into the idea of adaptive management a little bit, try to understand what it really means, and then also talk about some of the challenges in implementing adaptive management and why there aren't more success stories than there are. So today, our objectives are to learn a little bit, and I should say that I'm going to cover these topics fairly broadly because I'm doing this for a very general audience. And there's a lot more we could go into detail, but I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to try to cover the topic rather broadly. So we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of a decision analysis and what is it. Move from there into what we call dynamic decision problems. What makes dynamic decision-making problems adaptive? How does learning occur in adaptive management? And again, why is it that it seems to be so challenging? So all decisions involve two key components. That's the outcomes of the alternative choices that we have available to us and the objectives that we wish to achieve in choosing one of those alternatives. And difficult decisions typically involve ambiguity about one or both of those things. So decision analysis has evolved really over the last, I guess, 40 odd years maybe, as a means to identify the best choice in the cases where there's reasonable agreement about the objectives that you're trying to achieve, but there may be some degree of uncertainty about the outcomes of those choices. Adaptive management is actually a subset of decision analysis where the outcomes can be highly uncertain. And so that's the idea of, well, we have to learn better about the outcomes that we actually achieve so that we can make better decisions in the future. If the objectives in a decision problem, excuse me, I have terrible allergies this morning, I apologize. If the objectives in a decision problem are highly disputed, or the outcomes, that is the science of the problem is highly disputed, then there are other forms of collective decision-making that would be more appropriate. Okay, so in terms of decision analysis, let's take a sort of a toy example here that is actually completely made up. Other than the fact that we have this endangered butterfly in the Florida Keys, and our decision is whether to conserve additional habitat or to take no action, with the idea that our objective is long-term persistence of this endangered butterfly. So if we take no action, the best available science says, well, there's about a 50% chance then that this population would actually go extinct, and about a 50% chance that it would persist. So it's basically a coin toss. If we take no action and nonetheless the butterfly persists, well, then we give that a value of 1. Okay, and so what we're doing here is we're valuing the outcomes of decisions that we make. And we're just arbitrarily going to put these on a scale from 0 to 1. So if I take no action and the species persists, I get a value of 1, which is the best possible outcome because I didn't have to spend any money to conserve habitat. If the population actually goes extinct, that's the worst possible outcome. And so I assign it a value of 0. Okay, what if we choose to conserve habitat? Well, the best available science says, well, there's a pretty good chance, in fact, a 90% chance that the population will persist, and about a 10% chance that it'll go extinct. Okay, what values do we assign these two outcomes? Well, if the population persists, it's not as good as the action where we took no action and the population persists, because now we've had to spend money to conserve habitat. Okay, so the value is a little bit less than the best possible outcome. If it goes extinct, it's not the worst possible outcome because at least we tried. At least we can tell the public that we did conserve habitat and we, in fact, made an effort to keep it from going extinct. Okay, so what's the best decision in this little simple problem? Well, what we can do is say, well, what is the expected value or the average value, if you will, if we take no action? Well, it's just the value of the two outcomes here, weighted by their probability of occurrence. Okay, so what we get is an expected value of 0.5. We can do the same thing if we choose to conserve habitat. So now we just take a weighted average of these two values based on their probability of occurrence, and we get an expected value of 0.65. And so the best decision in this case, given the available science that tells us something about the outcomes, given the values that we place on those outcomes, we see that the best decision is to go ahead and conserve additional habitat. I guess one important thing I want to point out in this is, again, as I mentioned in a previous slide, the decisions involve both the outcomes and their probability of occurrence. And so that's the science part of decision making. And then we have to decide how we're going to value those alternative outcomes. And that's the subjective part, that those values then are assigned by the decision maker. And therefore, we can't say, let's just let the science decide. Okay, that's something that we often hear in the conservation world. Well, we should just let the science decide. Science doesn't decide, it's a critical component, but the objectives and the values of the decision maker also play a role. So how might the best decision in this case change? Well, it could change if the probabilities of the outcomes changed, or if the values assigned to those outcomes could change. And if either one of those things changes, then the best action in this problem might change. Okay, so now that was a decision-making problem that we just call a static problem or a one-off problem. Okay, it's a one-time decision that we make. But in fact, many decisions in conservation are dynamic in the sense that the same type of decision must be made repeatedly over time. And a key aspect of these problems is that we must assess the state of the system or the state of the resource that we're trying to manage at each decision point in time, and allow for the fact that we might make different decisions at each point in time than we did previously. So the idea is that we observe the state of the resource, we take some action, and then we derive some immediate value from taking that action. So value here is, as in the butterfly example, it's sort of benefits net of costs, okay? So then based on the action that we take and on a whole lot of uncontrolled environmental factors, the resource evolves to potentially a different state at the next time step. Then we must choose potentially a new action. We derive some immediate value, and then the process repeats itself sequentially over time. And the goal in a process like this is to maximize the temporal sum of values over some time frame. And that time frame might be finite, it might be a 10-year planning horizon, or in fact, it might be an infinite time frame where we're just saying that, you know, we want to sustain the resource and its values over some infinite time frame that extends those benefits to future generations. So solutions to dynamic decision problems are a lot harder to calculate than we saw with the butterfly example. And the reason is because we have to account not only for the immediate consequences of our decisions, but the future consequences of those decisions as well. And the way I like to think about this is to think about a marathon runner, okay? So a marathon runner needs to balance the need to run fast with the need to conserve energy in order to finish the race well. And so this trade-off between short and long-term consequences is a key feature of dynamic problems. Now, we can solve dynamic problems. Fortunately, there's an algorithm for solving these problems, which was actually developed during World War II for managing the inventory and distribution of military supplies, which is kind of cool to think about. And the solution to dynamic decision problems is a decision rule, sometimes called a strategy or a policy, that tells us what the best action to take is given the current state of the managed system. And so what you're seeing in this graph here is actually two such decision rules. This happens to be for tiger bean geese. And one in which the objective is to maximize a sustainable harvest, and one in which the objective is to solely to maintain a population size of around 70,000 in spring. So even though the science underlying this problem is the same, we can see that having different objectives for the problem leads to two different policies or decision rules. And so what this decision rule tells us is what the harvest quota should be given any particular observation of a population size. And again, under two different objectives. This sort of dynamic decision problem is often erroneously characterized as adaptive management. And so we're going to talk a bit about, in a little bit later on, about, okay, well, why isn't this adaptive management in any formal sense? So dynamic decision problems are pervasive in conservation. And so what we're going to do is look at a few from the conservation literature. And I'll show you some examples of these, but sustainable harvesting, controlling invasive species, habitat management. And in fact, there's very few examples of this in the literature in terms of habitat management that I can find. But we'll talk about one in a minute. Even reserve design, if you're trying to create a marine reserve or a reserve on the landscape, and if you can't afford to protect all of the sites that you want at once, and you have to sort of gradually build up the reserve over time, that's a dynamic decision problem. Okay, so let's look at some examples here. So probably most people on this call recognize that many goose populations in Europe have increased to the point that they're the source of social and economic conflict. So here's an example of a dynamic decision problem for managing the harvest of pink-footed geese. And the idea here is to maintain this population at some target level that's deemed acceptable by stakeholders. So acceptable to farmers in terms of the amount of conflict they have in terms of agriculture. And the population target is about 60,000 birds, give or take, and that's indicated by the two vertical dashed lines here in this plot. These are sort of acceptable population sizes. So the fall harvest quota, which are the colored contours here, depends both on the size of the population size that's observed in the spring, and also on the number of days above freezing on their breeding grounds and survival, and Svalbard, I'm sorry. And the reason for that is because warmer springs promote reproductive success. Okay, so if we look at these harvest quotas, we can generally see that certainly as population size gets bigger, the harvest quota gets bigger, but also as you go up the vertical axis here, you can see that the harvest quota gets larger when you have warmer springs because you expect higher reproduction. Here's a decision rule or strategy for managing a captive breeding program for Arabian oryx. And what we're looking at here is decisions about whether to simply do nothing, release captive individuals into the wild, or actually capture wild individuals and bring them into the captive breeding program. And the goal, of course, is to maximize the long-term probability of persistence of works in the wild. And so you can see that the decision depends both on the abundance of the captive population and on the abundance of the wild population. So when the wild population is fairly high and the captive population is fairly low, then you bring some animals into the captive breeding program. Conversely, when your captive population is very high, then you're going to tend to release animals into the wild. Here's an example about managing invasive species. This happens to be gypsy moths, which are invasive species in the eastern United States that cause defoliation of broadleaf trees. And the goal here then is to maximize the number of landscape patches that are free of infestations of gypsy moths. And the best course of action in this case is dependent on the number of patches in the landscape that have medium infestations and that have large infestations. And so here you can see the alternative choices that are available and what you would do given your observation of the status of the landscape at any particular time. Here's an example of managing the commercial harvest of oysters in the eastern United States. And the goal here is to maximize the sustainable harvest and the possible actions that the decision maker can take are the number of fishers that are permitted each year. And that's what's shown in these contour lines. So here's 200 fishers, 180 fishers, 160 fishers. The optimal number of permits that would be issued is a function of both the abundance of live oysters and the abundance of oyster shell, which provides settlement habitat for oyster larvae. And what we have here then, well, first you can see that, okay, if we have lots of live oysters and we have lots of shell, which provides reproductive habitat for oysters, we can see that the number of permitted fishers is quite high versus the situation in which the status of live oysters and shell is poor. Then in fact, we'll get down here in this corner where we actually don't permit any fishing at all. Okay, so what are all these squiggly lines here? So we can actually simulate the trajectory of the population over time, given that we follow this decision rule. And that's what you see in these squiggly lines here. You see that because of uncontrolled environmental variation and other stochastic factors, the number of live oysters, the abundance of shell, the number of fishers varies quite a bit over time, but it stays generally in this region here. This region down here is if we don't follow a rule that's prescribed or derived from our dynamic decision problem, but we just follow a rule that comes out of maximum sustained yield theory. What happens? Well, the population basically collapses and we end up with a very a system that's not very productive and therefore cannot support very many fishers. So this is the advantage of having a dynamic decision rule rather than a static decision rule that doesn't account for the fact that resource conditions can change over time. These sort of decision rules can get quite complicated. Here we have an example of a policy for managing fire-dependent habitat of Florida scrub jays, which are an imperiled species. The goal of this problem is to maximize the growth rate of the scrub jay population. And the state of the system is characterized by the number of sites that are classified by a successional stage, and whether a site has been previously mechanically treated or not. And the decision rule prescribes a decision to either do nothing, which is always a possible alternative, to conduct a prescribed burn, or to mechanically restore the site, depending on the number of sites that are in each of the system states. So this optimal and mixed and short, these are different successional stages. And so you can see that the do nothing alternative is really only optimal when we have scrub habitat that's in optimal condition. And we can see that if there's in a lot of other cases, then what we see is the best alternative is to do a prescribed burn. And in some cases, and in some extreme cases, the optimal action is actually to go in and mechanically cut the vegetation to restore succession to an earlier state. Okay, so again, these are all dynamic decision problems, but what makes a dynamic decision problem adaptive? Well, the problems and examples I just showed you, they're adaptive only in the sense that the actions can change depending on the state of the managed system. And so dynamic decision-making is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for adaptive management. Not all dynamic decision problems are adaptive, but all adaptive management problems are dynamic. Okay, so this is an important distinction that I want to make. So why isn't dynamic decision-making in and of itself, why isn't that adaptive? Well, what's missing is an explicit recognition of the uncertain effects of actions on the system transitions. The fact that when we take an action, we might not be sure of how that's going to affect the state of the managed system in the next time step. What's also missing is a process for reducing that uncertainty and therefore improving future decisions. So adaptive management is management in the face of uncertainty with a focus on its reduction. So remember I said that adaptive management is a subset of decision analysis in which the outcomes might be highly uncertain. And the idea then is that we want to try to use the experience of management to reduce that uncertainty so that we can make better decisions in the future. It's not trial and error management, which frankly, I see quite a lot of examples of that in the literature where they're claiming that's adaptive management. Basically the idea, you try something, if that didn't work out the way you want, well, then you try something else. Well, no, that's not what adaptive management is. We try to take a much more systematic approach to understanding the uncertainty and how we might reduce that. And so, as I said, it's not simply dynamic decision-making. Okay, since we've started talking about uncertainty now, let's talk about different flavors of uncertainty that we might encounter. So certainly environmental variation is a source of uncertainty that we almost always face. There's this notion of partial controllability. Okay, what's that? Where the outcomes deviate from management prescriptions. So an example is that certainly the harvest is affected by more than the length of the hunting season. Okay, we often attempt to control harvest by shortening or lengthening the hunting season, but there's a lot of other factors that come into play that we don't have control over that would affect what the level of harvest in a given year might be. Partial observability, the idea that we rarely know, for example, what the true size of the population is. We do counts, but there's some error associated with that, or we actually go out and we sample the population according to some sampling design, and then we have some sampling variance. So there's some uncertainty there about what the condition of the resource actually is. And then finally, we have this thing called structural uncertainty. This is really what the focus of adaptive management is. We can handle environmental variation, partial controllability, partial observability in simple dynamic problems, okay? The really key feature of adaptive management is that it's a dynamic problem where we focus on the structural uncertainty, this incomplete knowledge of the dynamics of the system that we're trying to manage and the effects of the actions that we might take. So an example that's often encountered is uncertainty about whether survival or reproductive processes are density dependent or density independent. And because these things are notoriously difficult to sort of try to understand in natural populations. Okay, so adaptive management then is an iterative process of making decisions, of monitoring the outcomes, asking whether the outcomes were ones that we expected based on the best available science. If not, trying to update the state of our science so that we can make better decisions in the future. So there's the management part, right, where we use the best science to make predictions. We consider the alternative actions and what those possible outcomes are. We identify an optimal or preferred alternative based on what our objectives are. We make a decision, implement it, and then there's the adaptation part in which we do some follow-up monitoring. We possibly gather other data that might be relevant. And then we update our science. We update the models that we use to make predictions. So that's the adaptation part. Okay, so I think there, I'd like to stop and we'll, if there are any questions, we can take those. If there are any comments or just observations that people want to make, we could do that as well. And then we'll take maybe a short 10 or 15 minute break. So Ava or Shania, I'll turn it over to you if anyone has questions or would like to make an observation.
Thanks, Fred. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone has a comment, you can either add it or add it to the chat, or take the request, raise your hand, and we'll give you the floor so you can also ask the question.
Yeah, that always makes me nervous when there are no questions, because that means I explain things really well or really poorly. If
there's one question, Fred, in the chat, would you like me to read it out, or?
No, yeah, no, I've got it. So how does adaptive management account for stakeholders changing their mind about something? Yeah, that's a really good and really difficult question, and unfortunately, it's a problem that comes up all the time. So let me see if I can try to answer this by first admitting there is no good answer for this. Okay, so if you'll remember sort of the little graph that I showed, saying that, okay, adaptive management is useful for dynamic problems when there might be a high level of uncertainty about the outcomes, but that it requires at least some level of consensus about the objectives and about the values that are in play in terms of making the decision. And adaptive management will work fine. That is, when I say will work, what does that mean? Well, it means that we can do a reasonable job of achieving our objectives and learning something about the system so we can make better decisions in the future. As long as the objectives don't change, okay? And so that's what I'm interpreting this person means by stakeholders changing their mind. If the objectives do change because stakeholders change their mind about things, the target population size for a given population, people change their mind about what that should be. That's fine, basically, as long as it doesn't change too frequently. Because if it changes too frequently, well, then you can't really measure whether you're achieving your objectives because your objectives are always changing. And it's also going to make learning more difficult as well. In some cases, it actually might improve learning, but generally it's going to make learning more difficult as well. So we'll talk more about this when we talk about some of the challenges to adaptive management. But what I like to try to do is to try to get stakeholders engaged early in the process and to understand what all the trade-offs are, because everybody can't achieve everything that they want, right? There's always trade-offs in conservation. And getting stakeholders involved early and developing some degree of mutual trust helps us establish some objectives that can be in place long enough to sort of get the process working. And then, after 5 years or after 10 years, you might want to go back and make sure that those objectives are still the right ones to be pursuing. Okay, let's see. Next question. Is there a way to at least estimate a minimum level of information needed regarding each of the components of the information needed to properly feed the model? For example, when it comes to hunting, it often happens harvest data are significantly incomplete when not missing altogether. Yeah, so I'm asked this question quite a lot because monitoring is expensive, right? It costs time and resources, and so often we just don't even have sort of the bare level of information available, particularly when it comes to things like imperiled species. There may be very little demographic information available on the species. And I guess my response when I'm asked this question is, okay, we'll do the very best job we can at decision making given the information that you have. And there's also a way that I'll show you later in which we can identify what the value of having certain information would be. How much would it improve our ability to meet our objectives? And so there's actually a quantitative approach for trying to figure that out. And we'll talk about that a bit later too. Just briefly, in terms of managing harvest, generally what I tell people is, okay, well, you at least have to give me periodic estimates of population size. And you at least have to give me periodic estimates of the harvest or the offtake. Doesn't have to be every year, but I have to have those periodically. If I don't have those, it's almost by definition, I can't make informed decisions. Okay, so I have to have some minimal level. And again, we'll talk about a little later, just briefly, how you basically decide what the value of information is and what you might be willing to spend to get it. Okay, so Sarah asks, how do you incorporate other benefits, costs of decision options? For example, if habitat conservation is expected to serve other benefits, even if the butterfly goes extinct? Great question, great question. And it's very straightforward to do. we can include lots and lots of objectives. And as you say here, some that may not relate directly to the focal species, but to ancillary benefits derived from either that species or from efforts to conserve that species. How we craft those objectives and sort of consider all those objectives in formulating a decision rule, that's a very complicated topic and something that we'll have to save for another time. But suffice it to say that, yes, we can do exactly what you're asking. Any others? Good questions. Really, really good questions. Even though I don't always have a good answer. Okay, Ava, I'll leave it to you for telling us how long our coffee break will be.
Well, also depends on you, but I guess like 15 minutes could be a good time. And to make it easier for everyone, we could start sharp.
Yeah, if we get back, so I don't know what time it would be your time. It would be 9 o'clock my time.
It would be 3 o'clock Central European time, but then again, whoever is connecting from somewhere else has to do the math themselves. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Then see you in 15 minutes then.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Right. Afternoon, everyone. We will continue the second part of this webinar on adaptive management, concepts, applications, and challenges. And our presenter, Dr. Fred Johnson, will take over from here. Please remember that we are recording this session and that the recordings will be added to the EGMP website on the YouTube channel. And if you have any questions, please use the chat function or keep your more complicated questions for after the presentation where we have a final Q&A. Fred, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Eva. Okay, so we're going to talk just a bit more about this notion that adaptive management is learning to manage and managing to learn. And in that sense, adaptive management has often been characterized as something called the dual control problem, because we're actually trying to do two things, right? We're trying to manage the physical system, whether it's population size or habitat conditions. But we're also trying to manage a knowledge system, okay, that represents our understanding of the dynamics of the physical system that we're trying to manage and the outcomes of the actions that we might take. But there's typically a trade-off in the success at managing these two systems. Certainly large perturbations of the systems can contribute greatly to my understanding of system dynamics, and yet negatively affect the achievement of my objectives. So another way of thinking about this is like, okay, well, if I take a precautionary approach to management, that might suffice for meeting my objectives, but it could also sacrifice the knowledge that could be used to improve future decisions. So smart adaptive management seeks to balance this trade-off. A key point to always remember about adaptive management, however, is that adaptive management recognizes the importance of learning only to the extent that it helps improve future outcomes. So in that sense, learning is valued only indirectly, okay? It's not about experimenting with a management system solely for the sake of understanding them better. It is, after all, adaptive management and not adaptive research. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples of adaptive management. The first here is probably the largest scale and longest running adaptive management process in the world, and it concerns the sport harvest of mallards in the United States. This program was begun in 1995, and it seeks to maximize sustainable harvest while at the same time maintaining the population near a continental goal. The decisions themselves concern the level of hunting regulation from a closed season to a very liberal season, and it's based on the choice then of a hunting season is based each year on population size and the number of wetlands in their breeding range. So that's what we see in these little individual boxes here. We have on the vertical axis, we have the number of mallards in North America in millions. And then we have ponds or wetlands, which are wetlands containing water on their primary breeding range, which is in southern central Canada and the north central United States. The knowledge, okay, so that's the physical system we're trying to manage, right? The hunting regulations and the impact that it has in providing hunting opportunity and the impact those regulations have on mallards themselves. But there's also a knowledge system that we have to account for as well. And so on these major axes here, you see on one hand, the probability that reproduction is strongly density dependent. And then on the other axis, we have the probability that hunting mortality is additive. Okay, so the converse of those are hunting mortality is compensated for by declines in natural mortality, or that reproduction is not strongly density dependent, but only weakly density dependent. Because of those are sort of binary hypothesis, we only have to represent one probability on each axis, because the two probabilities, for example, for additive hunting, mortality and compensatory mortality, those probabilities have to add to one, right? So we only have to represent one of those, with the probability of the other hypothesis being its complement. So you can see that if indeed we think that reproduction is strongly density dependent and hunting mortality is in fact compensatory, because we have zero probability on additive hunting mortality, then we can virtually have liberal hunting regulations under any conditions. If you look instead at the situation where we believe that reproduction is only weakly density dependent, and we have hunting mortality that's additive, represented by a probability of 1, then you can see for a lot of resource conditions, we actually have a closed season. Okay, so again, the idea is based, is that as in dynamic problems, the decision we make, the best choice we can make, is dependent on the status of the resource. But now it's also dependent on our understanding of the resource, its dynamics, and the effects of the decisions we might make. Okay, so how is that program played out over time? So in this top panel here, what we're looking at is the observed population size of mallards over time, again in millions, with those predicted by a set of models. Okay, and those models then encompass different hypotheses about reproduction and the survival process. And these predictions then are actually weighted by the amount of evidence that those different hypotheses have. So down here in this bottom panel, what we can see is how the weights, or the level of credibility, or the amount of evidence for the different models have changed over time. And so this model that seems to be accumulating the most weight or credibility over time is this model SARW, which simply means that The A stands for additive hunting mortality, and W stands for weakly density dependent reproduction. And so even though in 1995, we were completely unsure which model best described population dynamics, and so all four models had a weight of 0.25. As we compared predictions and observations over time, then we were able to see which of these models actually better predicted the change in population size that we actually saw. And so we can see down here at the bottom that the two models that incorporate strongly density dependent reproduction, and so there's one that includes additive mortality and one that includes compensatory mortality, that in the end of this time frame, and I think it just goes up to 2019, there's virtually no evidence to support those two models. So now the decision policy in any given year really is being driven largely by these two models here, and mostly by this model here. And so as a consequence, because over time it appears that the additive model is more correct, which would allow for less hunting, right? We also see that the weakly density dependent reproduction model is gaining credibility, and that also leads to more restrictive hunting regulations. You can see that over time, the decision rule for any given year, in this case 1995 and 2013, has grown more restrictive. Okay, so there's there's more closed seasons, there's more restrictive seasons under a combination of ponds or wetlands and population size than there was when we started the process in 1995. Okay, so this is the adaptation part, the idea that your decision rule evolves over time as your understanding of population dynamics improves. Here's another example of habitat management going back to scrub jays. In this case, the managers on a wildlife refuge were where they had a population of scrub jays. They were doing two different kinds of prescribed burns. One was sort of what they call routine burn. These were usually conducted in the winter. And so generally these were sort of cool fires, you know, slow burning fires that were not very intense. On the other hand, they could conduct what they called an intensive burn. This is typically during the summer. And these burns would be very much hotter, burn very much faster, and therefore might be more successful at setting back succession, which is important. Lower successional stages are better for scrub jays. But these burns were much more costly. They had to have a lot more equipment and a lot more people out there to manage the burn. And there was additional risk to public safety as well. And there was a lot of question about whether that intensive burn was really worth it. The additional expense of that intensive burn was worth it because there was uncertainty about whether it was really any more effective at setting back succession than was the routine burn. So we actually posited two different models, a null model that says, well, in fact, there really is no additional benefit to an intensive burn. And then an alternative model that says no, an intensive burn is very much more effective at setting back succession. And so here's a decision rule similar to what you just saw for mallards that says, okay, well, we do nothing, we do a routine burn, or we do an intensive burn, depending on the state of the scrub habitat. So this is OO is optimal and open habitat. It's just shorthand for this. This is the best habitat here. This tall habitat is the worst. These short habitat are not great, but if you leave them alone, they will grow or succeed into a cereal stage that is better for scrub jays. So if we have no confidence in the null model that says a routine burn and an intensive burn have about the same effect, well, then in fact, under some conditions, you actually use that intensive burn, right? Because you believe that intensive burn can be more effective. Okay, but generally the idea here, without going into a lot more detail about this, is that the decision you make is based on both the state of the physical system and the state of your knowledge system. It depends on both of those things. And what you want to know is, well, how does my relative confidence in these two competing models of scrub response to fire, how does that change over time? Okay, and so what I've got here is just an example. It's basically a simulation, okay? So I take that policy or that decision rule that I just showed you, and we simulate that over time, assuming the null model, assuming that in effect, that the intensive burn is no more effective than a routine burn. And so what happens over time? If we start this simulation, in this case, with a probability on the null model of 0.5, which means we're completely uncertain, right? We're completely uncertain about these two models, one that says an intensive burn is more effective and one that says, no, they're about the same. And what we can see is that by taking actions, and the actions are denoted in the sequence down here. R is a routine burn, N is we do nothing, I is we do an intensive burn. So as we make a sequence of decisions over time, what we learn is that, yes, indeed, it looks like that this null model is in fact the best model to describe the system. And if we take actions over time, we can see that, well, when we're unsure which model is correct, we do some both routine burns and some intensive burns. But once we learn that we're pretty sure that the null model that says routine and intensive burns are about the same, then we never do an intensive burn again. Because remember, the intensive burns are more expensive, but yet under the null model, they're not any more effective. So we wouldn't use them once we get to a certain level of confidence. Well, why does this confidence level never go above 82% or whatever it is? Well, that's because at that point, we become so sure of that model that we never use an intensive burn again. If we don't use an intensive burn, then we're not going to learn any more about which of those two models is the better one. So we just kind of plateau here at 82% or whatever it is. Up here, sort of in shorthand, is a description of the state of the system and how that changes over time. In this case, 5 is the tall, basically the climax cereal stage. And what happens is if all we have available to us is a routine burn, then ultimately that habitat is all going to be in the climax cereal stage, which is not going to be good for scrub jays. So what does this tell us? It tells us, well, then maybe we better start thinking about other actions other than prescribed burning to try to improve that habitat. This is something called double loop learning. Okay, so here we're learning about the models. Okay, here we're learning about how we frame the problem. And if the only thing available to us is to conduct the prescribed burn or to do nothing, well, then maybe we need to reconsider the possible actions that we might take to improve habitat. Okay, here back to our example about commercial fishing for oysters. Here we have two competing models of oyster dynamics. And the first model says that, yeah, we think density dependence is of a convex form, okay? Which means that the strongest effects of density is actually at very small population sizes. The second model posits that no, the density dependence is actually of a concave form, in which the density effects are strongest not at low population sizes, but at high population sizes. And so here, what we see is the panels that are analogous to what you saw before. So we have on this axis, we have the number of live oysters. On this axis, the amount of shell habitat that we have. And then the contours are the number of fissures that can be permitted in each year. What we have down here is the probability of one of the models being 0. Okay, so in this case here, we're sure that in fact, the form of density dependence is convex, because that convex density dependence produces a more productive system. So generally, you can see that at least in some cases, we can permit the maximum number of fissures. If we go to the opposite extreme, where we have a probability of 1 here, this is the case where we're sure that the model with convex density dependent is the correct model. And we can see that generally the system's less productive. It doesn't permit as many fissures as does the alternative model. And then on these panels in between, you can see that these are for different probabilities of the convex model. And you can see that we end up with policies or decision rules that are intermediate between these two extremes. Again, the decision you make is conditioned on the status of the resource and on the status of your understanding of that resource. Okay, got ahead of myself here a little bit. Okay, so let's look at what a simulation of this oyster fishery, of this policy, might look like under time. Okay, so here's our first model, D equals negative 1.5. All this is a parameter in a model that describes convex density dependence. And we can do what's called an equilibrium analysis, and we can say, okay, if we had a constant number of fissures each year, so we weren't changing the number of fissures each year, then what population size of oysters, that's the orange line, and what abundance of shell habitat, that's the green line, would we see over time? And so obviously for no fissures, we can see that they're relatively high. For larger number of fissures, then we get very low abundance of shell and oysters. And maximum sustained yield says, well, you should hold the number of fissures at around 45 or something like that. And that, in fact, would give you the maximum sustainable harvest. Well, we're not going to use a MSY rule. We're going to use the policy that I just showed you. And then we're going to simulate that over time, assuming that this model of convex density dependence is the correct one. And so this is a trajectory just like, or at least analogous to the one you just saw for scrub jays. We start out with a probability of 0.5. We're equally unsure which model is best. We vary the number of fissures, is what's down on this sequence here, over time. And in fact, in about 20 years, we do indeed learn that this model of convex density dependence is the appropriate one. But if we learn that, you can see that the number of fissures that the system can support in any given year is quite small. It's very much less than what would be subscribed by maximum sustained yield theory. And then up here, you can see what I have is the abundance of oysters. And this is just, these are in proportions of the maximum oyster abundance. So you can see that abundance stays fairly low. Well, what if in fact the model of concave density dependence is the correct one? Okay, well, these equilibrium conditions look very much different, right? And in fact, for a range of the number of fissures here, we actually see multiple equilibria in that system. This is something that the notion of multiple equilibria has been very much forefront in the ecological literature of late, and the idea that systems can reside in different stable states, and that you can end up in a very unproductive state, which might be hard to get out of. But at any rate, so if we assume that that model is true and we simulate the trajectory of our knowledge over time by following the decision rule I showed you in the previous slide, then what we find out is in this simulation, in about 10 years or so, we learned that in fact this is the true model, but it produces a very much more productive system. The number of fissures remains relatively high. The abundance of oysters remains relatively high. But importantly, we see that the number of fissures has to be regulated very closely. That we can't just go with a constant level of fissures, and that they have to be regulated on an annual basis. Okay, so a couple of things briefly before we move on to talking about some of the challenges in adaptive management. You may have heard about a distinction between what's called passive and active adaptive management. So the classic definition of passive adaptive management actually comes from Carl Walters, who was a fisheries biologist in British Columbia. And this idea actually came about in the 1970s and early 80s. Carl Walters was certainly a single person who did more than anyone else in terms of promoting the idea of adaptive management. But his idea of passive adaptive management was simply that you use the model that seemed to be best at the time a decision had to be made, and only change to a different model or to revise that model if the original model seemed to be performing badly. That is, that it made predictions that didn't correspond very well with the observed outcomes. And so the idea is very much on sort of short-term management performance, and only changing the science, the underlying model, when it seemed there was a need to do so. There's a more modern definition where we don't use a single model, but we use a weighted model. Okay, and so we always consider all the possible models, and then we update the weights or the level of credibility or the amount of evidence we have for those models at each point in the decision process. And the models that accumulate more weight or have more evidence, they're going to have more influence on the decision rule or the decision policy than models that don't have as much weight. But there's also this idea of active adaptive management, where the focus is on both management performance and on the learning to improve future performance. And here, there's actually an explicit consideration of how the alternative actions can help you discriminate among those competing models of system dynamics. And with the idea that if, again, remember in adaptive management, there's this short-term versus long-term trade-off. So the idea in active adaptive management is, can we take some actions in the short term that might help us learn something so that we can improve our performance and improve outcomes in the future, without sacrificing that future too much? So the classic example that I always give is, okay, if I'm hunting a population, if I really want to learn whether hunting mortality is additive or compensatory, then what would I do? Well, what I might do is impose some very, very, very liberal hunting regulations. And I might find out pretty quick whether hunting is additive or compensatory. But what have I done in the short term? If it turns out that it's additive, I've maybe now driven that population down to such a low level that now I'm sacrificing my long-term hunting opportunities. Okay, so the idea in active adaptive management is try to be explicit about this trade-off and try to figure out what sort of probing can I do to better understand the system so I can make better decisions in the future, but without sacrificing too much in terms of achieving my long-term objectives. Okay, let's see, I'm gonna read here in the chat. If you are conducting an AHM process, which is running several models, and over time you learn which individual model is most accurate in predicting outcomes, should you drop the other models or keep running them just in case conditions change? Is it worth the effort to run multiple models? Absolutely. I would never drop a model from consideration, because remember, again, if it doesn't have a lot of evidence, doesn't have a lot of weight, well, then it's not influencing my decision very much. But so there's no reason to discard it. Computationally, it's no more burdensome to keep it in than it is to throw it out. So there's no reason to throw it out, because as you say, Sai, conditions might change. And I've seen some examples, one with black ducks in North America, where it seems like the degree of additive hunting mortality has changed over time. And so you'd want to keep both models in there in case conditions change, because if they do, then you should see the weights shifting back to one of the other models, in which case then that model will begin to have more influence over the decision-making process. Good question, Si. Okay, so a lot going on with adaptive management here. Okay, it's a dynamic decision problem, but now we have to think about not only managing the physical system that we're ultimately interested in, we have to think about managing our knowledge system as well. And so the bottom line is, certainly in terms of developing an AM program, it can be expensive and time consuming. And so decision makers really deserve to know whether their investment is likely to be rewarded, right? So how do we go about motivating adaptive management in some formal way? Well, part of the reason we need to think about that is because if you were to ask any ecologist, and I'm sure most of you are ecologists, if we were to ask you what you're uncertain about in terms of managing any particular system, you know, if I'm going to ask you that, I better have a long time to hear the answer, right? Because after all, at least if you're being honest, there's going to, you know, you're going to profess to be certain about virtually nothing, right? There's always lots of uncertainty in these very complex ecological systems that we're attempting to manage or conserve. But do all those uncertainty matter in terms of making good conservation decisions? In other words, is the investment in learning and adaptive management likely to significantly improve performance over the long term? Because information costs money, right? To go out and monitor, to go out and work animals, it costs time and money. And so we have to think about ways to decide whether it's worth the additional cost to gain that information. And so there's a concept known as the value of information that attempts to address this problem. I'm going to give you as simple an example as I can here of the value of information, recognizing that this is a very deep topic. It's very much in recent years, suddenly there's a lot of articles in the conservation literature about trying to calculate the value of information. And it's a very deep topic. So I'm just going to touch on it very briefly with a very simple example here. And this comes from Carl Walters again. And at least all I'm trying to do here is sort of convey the basic concepts of this, okay? So in this example, the decision involves whether to build spawning channels around dams in British Columbia for sockeye salmon. And the structural uncertainty is whether or not these spawning channels will actually be effective or not. And certainly what we're trying to do is to not only conserve salmon, but to try to maximize the value of sockeye salmon harvest, okay? And in doing that, we have to consider what the cost of building these spawning channels is going to be. So what I'm showing you here is what's called a consequence table. Okay, so we have our two alternative choices. We can choose not to build the spawning channels, or we can build those. Okay, but we have two competing models because we're unsure of whether the spawning channels are going to be effective or not. We have a model that says no, they're not. They're not going to be effective. We don't really see any response by salmon. The other model says that no, in fact, they're likely to be very effective. We'll see a good response in salmon from building those channels. And because we're completely uncertain about which of these two models or hypotheses is correct, we're going to initially assign them a weight of 0.5 each. Okay. All right. So if we choose not to build the channel, then basically we're dealing with the status quo, okay? And so the current value of the fishery is $240 million, okay? So a lot of economic benefit to this fishery. But notice that if we choose not to build it, the value of the fishery is 240 under each model. Well, why is that? Well, if we don't build the channel, we're not going to know whether we get a response or not. So, you know, it's just the status quo. Okay, so it's 240 million in both cases, because whether we get a good response or not doesn't really matter because we haven't built the channel. Okay. On the other hand, if we choose to build the channel and we get no response, well, now the net value of the fishery has gone down because we spent what? 40 and 60, because we spent $105 million to actually build the spawning channels. Okay, so that's not a desirable outcome, right? We spend the money to build these things and we don't get any response. On the other hand, if we build it and we get a good response, wow, even after considering the cost of building the channel, we double the value of the fishery. Okay, so that's a highly desirable outcome, right? Well, how much would we be willing to spend to understand or to know which of these models was the best model? How do we determine that? How do we determine what we would be willing to spend for the information that would allow us to discriminate among these two models? Okay, first, let's sort of go back to our simple decision analysis that we did with the butterfly, and let's ask, what's the best decision if in fact we don't have that information, okay? That we just have to go based on what we know right now, which is complete uncertainty about these two models. Well, we do just like we did before. We take a weighted average of the outcomes. Okay, for do not build, it's 240 in each case, weighted by the probability of those outcomes, which is just 240 million, right? If we choose to build it, because we don't know which of these two outcomes that we might get, then we have to take a weighted average of those two, and we end up with a value, an expected value of $349.5 million. Okay, so what's the best decision in the absence of any new information? Okay, well, we build the channel, right? Now, if we build the channel, doesn't mean that we're going to get exactly 349 million. If we build it, we're going to get one of these two things, one of these two outcomes, right? But we don't know which, and so we have to take an expectation. And all that expectation does is tell us, well, basically, it's worth the risk to build the channel, okay? Because the gain here is so much higher than the loss here. All right, well, what if we actually knew which was the best model? Okay, well, if we knew that no response was the best model, what would we do? Well, we wouldn't build it, right? And the outcome would be 240. Well, if we knew it was going to be a good response, well, what would we do? Well, we'd build the channel, right? And then this would be the outcome. Okay, the little mental trick here that's maybe a little bit hard to grasp intuitively is the fact that although we know what the best decision would be under these two models and what the corresponding outcome would be, before we make the decision, we don't actually know which of these two models is going to be correct. So again, we have to take an expectation. And so the expectation, if we could resolve the uncertainty, is 402 million. Again, just the weighted average of these two values. So what's the value of information? Well, it's simply the difference between this, the expectation if we could resolve the uncertainty, minus the expectation in the absence of resolving that uncertainty. We get a value of $52.5 million. So if we could invest, for example, in a research program that would distinguish between these two, then we might be willing to spend $52 million to get that answer. We might also think about, all right, well, let's do an adaptive management program where we don't build spawning channels around every dam, but maybe we just pick a few dams and build spawning channels and see if they have a response. If we get a good response, then we start building spawning channels around more dams. Okay, so you sort of learn as you go and then manage based on what you learn. Okay, so if adaptive management seems to make so much sense in concept and seems to offer so much promise in cases of high uncertainty, why are there so few examples some 40 years after its introduction? And here's another quote by Kai Li that I think was really insightful. AM project planning reveals what managers are doing, whether it works, and whose interests it serves. So if you're a decision maker high up in some organization, this might make you a little nervous, particularly if the decision-making process you're using is not very transparent. And if there's very little accountability in the decision making. So I think this goes a long way towards explaining why why we don't see more adaptive management programs than we do. And okay, I call this hitting the wall. And often what we see is adaptive management becomes a perpetual planning exercise, as I said, because oftentimes at high levels in organizations, there's a reluctance to accept accountability or to share in decision-making. And so they put the burden back on scientists, okay? And suddenly modeling becomes the central focus, driven by the notion that, that we can, if we just do some more modeling, we can eliminate the fundamental uncertainties that we face in trying to make good decisions. That's not likely to be productive, because basically if the uncertainty could be resolved using existing information, we probably already would have done so. And so this modeling becomes basically a bit of displacement behavior. Often there are unrealistic expectations. The costs can be absorbed within traditional operating budgets. Typically, adaptive management requires a front-end investment and may be fairly substantial. Oftentimes that's not recognized, or the budget's just not available for it. Managers tend to think that they exert more control over system responses and behaviors than they do in most cases. And that, oh geez, we can learn fast and we can learn without significant perturbations to the system. So these are all unrealistic expectations. Also, oftentimes what we see is a lot of energy and enthusiasm for getting a program set up, but then there seems to be a lack of follow through in terms of monitoring and learning and adapting the policies. And certainly there's often a lack of communication or lack of effective communication and feedback to key stakeholders to maintain support for sustaining the process over time. So more often than not, what happens is all that results in a loss of enthusiasm for adaptive management, and thus not only for its implementation, but certainly for its sustainability over time. And often what I see, at least, is the status quo basically becomes sort of the rational choice until more is, quote, known. Okay, so what might we do to sort of push back on some of those tendencies? Because I'm a troublemaker, I think in these terms, infiltrate the ranks of bureaucrats married to the status quo. Anytime I've ever been involved in a situation where somebody at the top of an organization dictates or sends out an edict that thou shalt do adaptive management, more often than not, I see these efforts fail. They fail because at that level, there's less transparency, certainly less willingness to acknowledge uncertainty and risk. Often they're resisted by the rank and file, because people down the line that have to implement the program, it's like, oh my gosh, here's one more edict from on high, and they don't even know whether it's needed or not. Also, these things tend to have a higher public profile, and at least initially, that can invite a lot of controversy and cause more problems. Bottom-up efforts, those that are begun by sort of the rank and file in management agencies, they're typically easier to manage because they're smaller in scope. At least initially, they have fewer number of players. There's more flexibility in exploring alternatives that haven't been considered in the past. More sort of opportunity to explore a range of values. And eventually, it garners more ownership in the process. Use what we call here in the States anyway, a skunk works, which is an idea that you have sort of a core development team of less than 15 or so participants. Anything larger than that gets a bit unwieldy, especially in the early stages of this sort of process. Obviously, you need to ensure from the outset that all stakeholders' interests are represented. It doesn't mean that all the stakeholders need to be at the table, but it does mean that all that full range of interests need to be represented. Need to ensure that all skill sets are represented. Obviously, we need resource managers, or those that are at least responsible for making recommendations to the decision makers themselves. Obviously, you need ecological scientists. In controversial problems, certainly, like wolf management, for example, you're going to need social scientists as well, because of the potential social and economic conflicts that are present in those problems. Human dimensions people, social scientists, sort of the same thing. Communication. Communication is often something we think about in conservation after we've made a plan. And how do we communicate that? How do we sell that? But communication really is important at all stages of development, and not just communicating what you've done or what you've developed, but also mechanisms for getting feedback from others, so that, again, the idea that you can build ownership in the process over time. Every single adaptive management program that's been successful, at least those that I'm familiar with, has had a champion, an individual who has sufficient leadership skills, has the time to devote to this sort of process. They have expertise or experience in both the research arena and the management arena, because sometimes, resource managers and ecological researchers, sometimes they just really don't know how to communicate with each other very well. And it takes somebody to be able to sort of stand in that divide and build a bridge between those two communities. Certainly, they've got to have a lot of enthusiasm for the process, good communication skills. And then this is really key, can be trusted to be impartial, to be an honest broker, to not come into a decision-making problem with an agenda, with an idea of what the best decision is. You want to be someone, or you want to champion who's someone that can go, my agenda is to help decision makers make the best decisions they can. It's not for me to judge whether those decisions are good or bad based on my personal values. And certainly my experience just got to be persistent as hell. Okay, so last slide, I think. It's worth emphasizing that an effective institutional process for adaptive management involves 3 different frames of reference. There's an iterative process that we've talked about a lot, which is the notion of we take some actions, we observe the outcome, we compare those outcomes with what we predicted would happen. We update our science, we make new decisions, and on this iterative process rolls through time. But that iterative process is embedded in a problem frame in which objectives and alternatives have to be agreed upon. We have to develop system models. We have to make sure that adequate monitoring is in place. And then lastly, that problem frame is embedded in a contextual process in which we identify and include stakeholders. We have to define what the governance structure is. We have to subscribe to legal mandates. And ultimately, we have to provide the resources necessary to develop and sustain the process over time. And it's important to recognize that learning can occur within any of these decision frames and ultimately can affect changes in some of these other frames of reference. For example, the failure to make reliable predictions in this iterative phase might cause us to reconsider the models that we're using to make those predictions and develop new models or to revise the existing models. The failure to achieve objectives might motivate the need to amend or change rules or laws that limit the effectiveness of management. A good example I can think of there is barnacle geese and the fact that there's basically a law that says they can't be hunted. That law was created when barnacle geese were at a very low population size. And now we're in a situation where they're taking over the world. And so, maybe that should give us reason to go back and consider that legal framework for barnacle geese. Okay, we're a little bit short on time here. I think I've just got a couple of slides here. All of you are going to get copies of these slides as well as the notes that go with them. Rather than reading these to you, I think we'll just go straight to Q&A. Again, just remember that dynamic decision-making in itself is not adaptive management. There has to be a recognition that there's a knowledge system there that we're also trying to manage. And that there are going to be institutional difficulties. But these can be overcome, assuming that you've got strong leadership. And again, I think in all cases, it's pretty clear that there has to be an individual that can sort of serve as a champion to carry the process forward. Okay, with that, I'd like to thank the EGMP Secretariat and the Data Center at Aarhus. And I'd like to thank all of you for taking a couple hours of your valuable time to have a listen. So with that, I think we'll take some questions if there are any. Okay, I'm gonna try to look at my chat here and see what I can.
There's already one question in the chat.
Okay, I've got it. And this comes from Vicky. Thanks for the really great explanations. In making management decisions, trust and transparency are important. But what if decision makers and many of the stakeholders who might be generally bought into the principles of adaptive management might not really be in a position to thoroughly understand the complexities of adaptive management, including modeling? What can be done to ensure transparent and accountable, inclusive decision-making when participants have a variety of backgrounds and skill sets? Communication. Modeling certainly can be, can put people off that don't spend their careers doing this sort of thing, which is why my sort of golden rule is, even though ecological systems are complex, we don't necessarily need complex models to manage them successfully. Excuse me, simple is better. And the old adage, whether Einstein actually said it or not, make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. And what, when I was talking about a champion that needs to be able to sort of bridge the divide between managers and decision makers and those of us that are ecological scientists, that is absolutely key. That person has to be able to sort of speak both languages and can interpret things for decision makers in terms that they can understand. Often in these processes, as you point out, there are lots and lots of stakeholders. And you can't always involve all of the stakeholders directly in the process. But what you want them to understand is that their values are being recognized and being explicitly accounted for. That takes a lot of communication back and forth with stakeholders. It also takes, in many cases, trying to make decision makers aware that there, are an array of values that have to be considered. There's always going to be trade-offs, and most reasonable people will understand that in any decision-making process, they're not going to get everything they want. Okay, but if they can have trust in the process And they recognize that, that not only their values are being explicitly recognized, but their different views about how the world works and the effects of actions we might take, if that's being explicitly recognized in our knowledge system, then I think most stakeholders will be willing to say, yeah, okay, there are trade-offs here. Not everybody gets what they want, but hopefully everybody gets a little bit of what they want. So managing these sort of processes, particularly for international conservation problems that involve lots of countries, lots of actors, and lots of stakeholders, can be very complex, as Ava, I'm sure you can attest. And but we've done some things successfully at a continental scale in North America, and now at a continental scale in Europe, that I think demonstrate, although we've got a lot to learn and a lot of things to improve, that we can do this. But it does take an investment and a commitment. Okay, this from Melina. Fred, quick question. Can nature organizations be seen as a champion in leading, initiating an AM program, or do they rather seem too biased in the eyes of some stakeholders, decision makers to start with? Generally, I think, yes, that's true. Because nature organizations, NGOs, they have an agenda, right? And so whether it's FACE or whether it's BirdLife, for example, I mean, they have a very clear agenda to promote. And so what we need is somebody that can serve as an honest broker, that can communicate with both of those groups and get both of those groups to trust in a process that is going to include both their values that in fact may conflict. But yeah, I'm trying to think of an example, and I can't think of one where an NGO is actually successfully led an adaptive management effort.
Fred, there is another question beforehand from Fernando Spina.
Okay, let me. Okay, Fernando. Okay, trying to see adaptive modeling under a perspective of challenging realities. Within an AHM scenario, so I assume you're talking about adaptive harvest management here, at a flyway scale, can hunting release schemes be included when modeling? Can you clarify, Fernando, what a hunting release scheme is for me? I'm not familiar with that term.
Of individuals which are captive bred and which are released in the wild belonging to huntable species in order to increase the number of birds. Okay,
so can hunting release schemes be included in modeling, or is it the addition of external and often poorly known controlled components of individuals a difficult variable to account for? In collecting population size data, how to deal with hunting releases when released individuals cannot be set apart from other ones. Okay, well, the short answer is yes, you can. You can account for it explicitly as part of the decision-making process, and so that you could actually simultaneously be making decisions about the appropriate level of hunting, as well as the need for releases, recognizing there's a cost associated with that, or it could be considered implicitly, sort of as an uncontrolled source of noise, if you will, in the system, as a source of uncontrolled environmental variation. I've actually seen it handled, well, at least an attempt to handle it both ways in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States, there's a lot of release of mallards to supplement hunting. And there was some effort to try to look at how to bring that into the decision-making process in an explicit way. But I think in the end, what they did was just allowed that sort of uncontrolled environmental variation in the system. And so just tried to account for that when they were doing surveys of population size and when they were making decisions about the effects of hunting. So, but the short answer is yes, you can, there are a number of different ways to account for that. Any others? I know we're just a few minutes over here. Any observations that anybody wishes to make based on perhaps their personal experience in trying to do some of this, whether it's dynamic decision making or adaptive management, other than the fact that it can be hard.
I guess if no one else takes the floor, obviously I've got some stories to share and tell of the European Goose Management Platform, where we are also, attempting to have some sort of adaptive management, also confusing a little bit sometimes the terms and having to struggle with issues like, transparency, involving all the stakeholders, giving everyone a voice, balancing values, trade-offs, and particularly what you mentioned beforehand, the communication aspect of this, how essential that is. But at the same time, this whole process also consumes a lot of time and resources. And my, feeling and experience from the EGMP is that over the years, it is easy to lose faith and trust in the process because it is a complex, a complex mechanism, and it really takes a long time to first even understand these concepts and have trust in such a process, and then also visualize properly the results and achievements from a process where you're investing so much. So it's just an observation, just from the EGMP perspective, and I'm sure others here in the webinar feel with me.
Before we go, Eva, just mention once again that for all the participants, although the recording of the webinar will be on the EGMP website, I will send a PDF of the slides and the notes that go with the slides to everyone, so you have that. And I also will be requesting of you that you complete a short evaluation of the webinar in terms of what you thought was good and what you thought was maybe not so good, so that in the future we can improve this sort of thing.
Fred, there's one other question in the chat.
Okay, which one is this one? Who's this from?
I can quickly read it out. How is the learning from different AHM processes best recorded so it can be applied to new processes and the same mistakes won't be repeated?
Okay. Is that in the chat? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, I see it. Oh, okay, from Vicky, I see it now. How is the learning from different AHM processes best be recorded so can it be applied to new processes and the same mistakes won't be repeated? Yeah, so with adaptive harvest management in the United States, as I mentioned, it's been the sort of the largest scale and longest running adaptive management program in the world. And lots and lots and lots has been written in terms of evaluating that program, both from a scientific standpoint and from an institutional perspective as well. Unfortunately, journal manuscripts are not the best way to communicate with them. They're important, obviously, but not necessarily the best way to communicate with decision makers and managers that oftentimes they just don't have the time to read the conservation literature. So this is something that that Ava and I and others in the EGMP have been talking about a lot lately. How do we demonstrate what we've learned and the successes that we've had and the benchmarks that we've achieved in the process. And unfortunately, again, communication is more often sort of an afterthought. So I'm not sure I answered your question. If you think back to the graph I had for mallards in the United States and the time trace of what we've learned about those different models over time. And then I showed something similar for scrub jays and for oysters, but those were simulations of learning. That wasn't actually, a program that was in place and actually what we learned. That graph I showed for mallards is actually the only figure that I'm aware of in the entire world that documents what we've learned from an adaptive management process over time. And part of maybe the main reason is that there's so few examples of a bona fide adaptive management process that's been implemented long enough to learn from it so that the information can be applied not only in that program, but for other similar programs. We're just not there yet. And again, we just have to find better ways of getting the messages out about what we do learn in these sort of processes.
Thank you, Fred. I see no more questions in the chat, but I'll have another, since we're already over time, round. Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment or a question or share some experience?
Yeah, I do apologize for going over, but I do appreciate everybody's time.
I think otherwise I would suggest that we close this webinar session for today. If you agree, Fred?
Yes, sounds good.
Very good. Well, thanks to everyone who's joined the webinar, and thank you especially, Fred, for preparing and introducing us into this very, very complex but also very exciting topic. I would like to remember to everyone that we'll be saving presentations, recording, circulating the questionnaire that Fred mentioned beforehand, and also just use this opportunity to remind you that there will be another webinar organized on the 3rd of March, pretty much almost the same time. Information is available on the EGMP website, and that webinar will focus a bit more on the EGMP, the European Goods Management Platform, how it works, what is coming up in the next annual meeting of that working group, and yeah, a few concepts picking up on some of the background that Fred has provided now. Thanks, everyone. Fred, do you want to say any last words?
No. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, thanks.